Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with bullets, but with truths we've avoided for years. A woman returns to a man she once left behind, not for love, not for forgiveness, but because her son deserves answers. What she finds is more than a stolen ranch. It's a man who never knew he was a father, and a past that never truly let go. Stay with me, because this story will touch something deeper than you expect.
The Texas sun had a way of baking the patience right out of a man. And by 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, I didn't have a drop left. I leaned against the side of the buckboard, pulling my Stetson low over my eyes to block the glare off the dusty train depot. In my shirt pocket sat a crumpled letter, read exactly once, and hastily replied to. My ranch, the Thorn operation, was expanding. With 30 hungry ranch hands working the summer roundup, my foreman, Hutch, had threatened to quit if I didn't hire a proper cook. So I'd hired Mrs. S.J. Miller, a widow from out of state, needed room and board, claimed she could bake bread that would make a grown man cry. I hadn't asked for a tintype, hadn't asked for references. I just needed someone who could sling hash and keep the crew from burning down the bunkhouse kitchen. I'd hired her without a second thought. The piercing shriek of the locomotive whistle shattered the quiet of the station. A massive beast of iron and steam rolled in, spitting black smoke into the cloudless blue sky. I pushed off the wagon, boots crunching against the gravel. The platform flooded with people. Salesmen in cheap suits, ranchers, mail clerks. I scanned the crowd for an older woman. Someone worn down by grief and looking for a hot stove to hide behind. Instead, the crowd parted and my blood stopped cold in my veins. She was struggling with a heavy canvas travel bag, her head bowed against the steam, but I didn't need to see her full face. I'd memorized the curve of her neck, the way those unruly dark waves escaped her pins, the exact shade of her skin in the dim light of a Denver hotel room nearly 3 years ago, Sarah Jane. The air punched out of my lungs. For 3 years, her ghost had haunted the corners of my ranch. 3 years of waking up reaching for a woman who had vanished before dawn, leaving nothing but the lingering scent of wild lavender on my sheets and a cold, empty bed. I had torn half of Colorado apart looking for her, only to come up with dust. And now here she was, standing on a train platform in my town, holding a letter of employment bearing my forged, unthinking signature. S.J. Miller. Sarah Jane. A dark, possessive anger coiled in my gut, hot and heavy. She had run from me, and now she was walking right back into my territory. I took a step forward, ready to grab her by that fragile shoulder and demand to know why the hell she'd disappeared. Then she turned around, my boots cemented to the wooden planks. Settled on her left hip, clutching the collar of her faded cotton dress, was a child. A boy. He was small, maybe 2 years old, wearing a tiny linen shirt and a mop of dark hair that matched hers. He shifted, burying his face in her neck. Sarah Jane murmured something soft to him, a smile touching her lips, a smile I hadn't seen since she was tangled in my arms. Then the boy lifted his head and looked straight across the platform. He looked straight at me. The world stopped spinning. The hiss of the train, the chatter of the crowd, the blinding heat of the sun. It all vanished into a suffocating vacuum. I knew those eyes. I saw them every morning staring back at me from the shaving mirror. They weren't just blue or gray. They were the color of a frozen winter lake. The Thorn family eyes. A genetic stamp so strong my father used to call it our curse. I stood paralyzed as the math slammed into my skull. Denver. Nearly 3 years ago. A boy who looked to be exactly the right age. Mine. A roar started in my ears, primal and deafening. I didn't realize I was moving until I was closing the distance between us, my strides eating up the platform. Sarah Jane looked up. She froze. All the color drained from her face, leaving her pale as a ghost. Her grip on the canvas bag slipped, the heavy canvas hitting the wooden floorboards with a dull thud. Her arms tightened instinctively around the boy. "Elias," she breathed. Her voice was just as I remembered, soft, carrying a slight tremor that went straight to my chest. She took a half-step backward, her eyes darting toward the train as if calculating whether she could run back on board before it departed. "Don't even think about it," I growled, my voice low and rough like grinding stone. I closed the last 3 feet between us, towering over her. She swallowed hard, her chest rising and falling rapidly. I didn't know the Thorn Ranch belonged to you. The letter just said E. Thorn. You're a bad liar, Sarah." I didn't look at her. I couldn't. My gaze was locked on the boy. He was staring at me, unafraid, his thumb resting near his mouth. He had my jaw. He had my brow. He was a miniature living ghost of me, breathing and blinking in the arms of the woman who had stolen him. "His name?" I demanded, the words barely making it past the tightness in my throat. She pulled him closer, a fierce maternal defiance sparking in her eyes despite her trembling frame. "Elias, please. This is a mistake. I'll get back on the train. We don't need to." "His name, Sarah." I stepped closer, entirely crowding her space, boxing her in against the side of the depot. The scent of her, that same maddening lavender, hit me like a physical blow. "Leo," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Leo, my son." Every protective territorial instinct I possessed erupted in my blood. She had kept him from me. 2 years of his life, gone. 2 years of a son I didn't know I had. I wanted to tear the station apart. I wanted to scream. But more than anything, I wanted them off this public platform and safely behind the locked gates of my land. I reached down and snatched her heavy canvas bag off the floorboards in one fist. With my free hand, I grabbed her elbow, not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to leave no room for argument. "What are you doing?" she gasped, stumbling as I pulled her toward the buckboard. "You signed a contract, Mrs. Miller," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You need room and board. I need a cook." "I'm not going with you," she hissed, trying to dig her heels into the dirt. I stopped beside the wagon and turned to face her. I looked from her panicked face to the wide, icy gray eyes of the boy on her hip. "My son." "You ran from me once in the middle of the night," I said, leaning in close so only she could hear the absolute unwavering vow in my words. "You took what was mine, and you hid him from me. I am putting you in this wagon, Sarah Jane, and heaven help the man who tries to stop me from taking my family home." The wagon ride back to the Thorn Ranch was an exercise in pure, suffocating torture. The Texas sun beat down on us mercilessly, baking the cracked leather of the buckboard seat, and kicking up clouds of red dust beneath the horses' hooves. But the heat of the afternoon was nothing compared to the fiery, chaotic inferno raging inside my chest. I drove the team with a rigid back, my jaw locked so tight my teeth ached. Every instinct I had screamed at me to pull the wagon over, jump down and demand answers until my throat bled. But I couldn't. Not with the boy, my son, sitting between us. Leo had fallen asleep about 2 miles out of town. The rhythmic sway of the wagon had lulled him into a deep, peaceful slumber. He was slumped against Sarah Jane's side, his small, dark head resting just beneath her collarbone. One of his tiny hands was fisted in the worn fabric of her dress. I couldn't stop looking at him. Every few seconds, my eyes would drag away from the winding dirt road to trace the lines of his face. He had my nose. He had the stubborn set of my brow. Looking at him was like looking at a ghost of my own childhood, conjured up from the dust and dropped right into the middle of my life. 2 years. She had kept him from me for 2 damn years. I chanced a glance at Sarah Jane. She sat stiffly, her spine ramrod straight, staring blankly ahead at the horizon. The wind had whipped several strands of that thick, dark hair loose from its pins, brushing against her pale cheek. She looked exhausted, worn down by a weight I couldn't yet name. Part of me wanted to pull her across the bench and bury my face in her neck, breathing in that wild lavender scent that had haunted my dreams. The other part of me wanted to shake her. "How?" I finally asked. The words scraped out of my throat, harsh and grating over the rumble of the wagon wheels. She flinched, She didn't look at me, but her arms tightened protectively around the sleeping boy. Elias, not now. Please. Not in front of him. He's asleep, Sarah. He wakes up easily, and he understands more than you think. Her voice was a fragile, trembling thing, but there was a core of steel beneath it. She finally turned her head to meet my gaze. Her dark eyes were pools of apprehension, but she held her chin high. I'll answer your questions. All of them. But not out here in the dirt. I held her stare for a long, heavy moment. Then I snapped my gaze back to the road and flicked the reins. Fine. But you aren't sleeping tonight until I get the truth. The rest of the ride passed in agonizing silence. By the time the massive wrought iron gates of the Thorn Ranch came into view, the sun was beginning its descent, bleeding hues of bruised purple and fiery orange across the vast Texas sky. When I pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the main house, Hutch, my foreman, came out to the porch. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag, taking in the sight of the beautiful, terrified woman and the sleeping toddler with raised eyebrows. "Boss," Hutch said slowly, "I told you to fetch a cook. Looks like you brought back a whole family." "She's the cook, Hutch," I said sharply, stepping down from the wagon. I didn't offer any further explanation. I couldn't. Not yet. I walked around to her side and reached up. "Give him to me." Sarah Jane hesitated, her arms locking instinctively around Leo. "He's heavy. I can carry him." "Sarah." My voice was low, carrying a warning. "Give me my son." She swallowed hard, the fight draining out of her at the undeniable truth in my words. Slowly she leaned forward and transferred the warm, dead weight of the sleeping boy into my arms. The moment Leo's small body pressed against my chest, something fundamental inside me fractured and resettled. He smelled of milk, dust, and little boy. He snuffled in his sleep, turning his face into the crook of my neck, his tiny breath puffing hot against my skin. A wave of emotion so violent, so profound it nearly brought me to my knees, washed over me. Mine. This perfect breathing miracle was mine. I turned on my heel and carried him into the house, leaving Sarah Jane to follow with her canvas bag. I directed her to the room off the back of the kitchen. It was meant for the hired help, a modest but clean space with a sturdy iron bed, a washstand, and a braided rug over the oak floorboards. I laid Leo down on the mattress, gently pulling off his dusty boots. Sarah Jane hovered in the doorway, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. "Let him sleep," I murmured, stepping away from the bed. I turned to her, my chest tight. "Kitchen. Now." I didn't wait for her. I walked into the massive ranch kitchen, lit a kerosene lantern, and set it in the middle of the heavy oak table. The yellow light cast long, dancing shadows across the room. I poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle I kept in the pantry, sliding one across the table just as she walked in. She ignored the glass, wrapping her arms around her waist as if trying to hold herself together. "I didn't know it was you," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "The advertisement in the Denver paper said E. Thorne. Texas is a big state, Elias. I had no idea." "Stop lying to me," I growled, bracing my hands on the table and leaning toward her. "You expect me to believe it was a coincidence? You just happened to apply for a job at the exact ranch owned by the man you slept with 3 years ago?" "Yes," she fired back, a spark of anger finally lighting up her dark eyes. "I was desperate. My landlord kicked us out. I had a child to feed, Elias. I saw a posting that offered room and board for a cook, and I took a train. That's the truth." I stared at her, searching her face for the deception. But all I saw was a desperate, exhausted mother. It made my chest ache, but the betrayal still burned too hot. "Why did you run?" I demanded, dropping my voice to a dangerous octave. "That morning in Denver, I woke up and you were gone. Not a note. Nothing." She looked down, her throat working as she swallowed. "We were from different worlds, Elias. You were in town negotiating cattle contracts worth thousands of dollars. You were a wealthy, powerful rancher. I was a nobody. A girl working behind a hotel desk. It was one night. It wasn't just one night, and you damn well know it, I snapped, slamming my palm flat against the table. The glasses rattled. It meant something. It meant something to me. And then what? She cried, her head snapping up, tears shining in her eyes. You would have taken me back to Texas as your mistress? As a charity case? And then, when I realized I was pregnant, what was I supposed to do? Send a letter begging for money? Let you take my child out of some misplaced sense of honor? I would have married you! The words ripped out of me, echoing loudly off the kitchen walls. Sarah Jane froze, her breath catching in her throat. I rounded the table, closing the distance between us until I was standing inches away from her. She looked up at me, trembling. I tore Denver apart looking for you, I confessed, my voice dropping to a ragged whisper. I hired Pinkertons. I checked every boarding house. I thought about you every damn day for 3 years, and you were out there, struggling, raising my son alone because you were too proud or too scared to tell me the truth. I was protecting him, she whispered, a tear finally spilling over her lashes and cutting a clean track through the dust on her cheek. From me? The thought felt like a knife twisting in my gut. From everything. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a folded, crumpled piece of paper, the contract I had sent in the mail bearing my signature. She smoothed it out on the table with shaking hands. I am here now, but I am here to work. I need this job, Elias. I will cook your meals. I will feed your men. But that is it. We are employer and employee. You will not try to take him from me. I looked down at the piece of paper. It outlined her duties, her meager wages, her position as hired help. Then I looked at the woman I had spent 3 years agonizing over, the mother of my child, trying to hide behind a piece of paper. A dark, possessive calm settled over me. I reached out, picked up the contract, and held it between my hands. Slowly, deliberately, I tore it perfectly in half. Sarah Jane gasped, her eyes widening. What are you doing? I stacked the halves and tore them again, then again, letting the confetti of paper fall to the oak floor. There is no contract, I said softly, stepping into her space so completely that my chest brushed against hers. I reached up, my calloused fingers gently cupping her jaw, my thumb wiping away her tear. She shivered at my touch, her breath hitching, but she didn't pull away. You aren't my hired help, Sarah Jane, I murmured, my eyes dropping to her lips before locking onto her dark, wide eyes. You aren't a widow, and you sure as hell aren't leaving this ranch. You and Leo are mine. You're going to stay in my house, eat at my table, and I'm going to take care of you both. I'm going to be a father to my son. And as for you and me, I leaned in, my lips brushing the shell of her ear. We have a lot of lost time to make up for. I stepped back, leaving her standing there, breathless and wide-eyed in the lantern light. Get some sleep, Sarah. Breakfast is at 5. Soon by the end of the 2nd week, the Thorn Ranch had undergone a transformation I couldn't have predicted, and it was entirely due to a 110-pound woman with flour on her nose. The air around the bunkhouse and the main house, usually smelling of horse sweat, chewing tobacco, and stale coffee, had been permanently replaced by the heavenly aroma of rising yeast, cinnamon, and roasting meat. Sarah Jane had taken over my kitchen like a general commanding an army. My men, 30 hardened, foul-mouthed Texas cowboys who usually ate beans and hardtack without complaint, were suddenly acting like domesticated lapdogs. Hutch, a man who had once broken a wild Mustang with a fractured collarbone, now dutifully wiped his boots on the porch mat and took his hat off the moment he smelled S.J.'s buttermilk biscuits. I stood on the back porch, leaning against the wooden railing with a mug of black coffee, watching the morning chaos. S.J. was out by the wash pump, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, laughing at a joke one of the younger ranch hands Billy had just made. My jaw tightened instinctively. I didn't like how Billy was looking at her. I didn't like how any of them looked at her. Despite my declaration the night she arrived, S.J. had fiercely maintained her boundaries. She cooked, She cleaned, she kept to her room at night, and she treated me with a maddening polite distance. Yes, Mr. Thorne. No, Mr. Thorne. I'll have the stew ready by 6, Mr. Thorne. It was driving me insane. The slow burn of having her in my house, smelling her lavender soap in the hallways, watching the sway of her hips as she moved around my kitchen. It was a daily torment. But I didn't push. I was a patient man when it came to breaking wild things, and SJ was spooked. She needed time to realize I wasn't going to hurt her. Besides, my patience was paying off in the one area that mattered most, Leo. Elias! I looked down. A tiny weight slammed into my knee. Leo was clutching my denim pant leg, looking up at me with those staggering ice-gray eyes. His face was smeared with what looked like blackberry jam. The tight coil of jealousy in my chest instantly vanished, replaced by a profound, melting warmth. I set my coffee mug on the railing and crouched down, scooping the boy up into my arms. He felt natural there, like a missing piece of my soul finally clicking into place. "Hey there, little man," I murmured, using my thumb to wipe the jam off his cheek. "You been terrorizing your mother's kitchen?" "Horse!" Leo demanded, pointing a sticky finger toward the corral. I chuckled, a deep rumble in my chest. Over the past 2 weeks, Leo and I had established a routine. While SJ baked, I stole my son. I had introduced him to the gentlest mare on the property, a sweet old girl named Buttercup. "All right, let's go see the horses." I carried him out to the corral. I didn't miss the way SJ's laughter stopped, her dark eyes tracking us from the wash pump. There was a lingering fear in her gaze whenever I took Leo, a silent terror that I was going to ride off with him and never come back. I made a point to keep myself in her line of sight, hoping that over time the fear would fade. I hoisted Leo up, sitting him carefully on the top rail of the fence while I stood right in front of him, my arms caging him in so he couldn't fall. He giggled, reaching out his small hands to pat Buttercup's velvet nose as she ambled over for a scratch. "Gentle," I instructed softly, guiding his little hand. "Like this." "Gentle," Leo babbled, his gray eyes wide with wonder. I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out a small, roughly carved wooden horse. I'd spent the last 3 evenings sitting on the porch with a whittling knife, carving it from a block of cedar. It wasn't perfect, but it had 4 legs and a mane. "Here," I said, pressing it into his hands. "Something for you to ride when Buttercup's too tired." Leo gasped, dropping the toy immediately, and instead throwing his small, sticky arms around my neck, burying his face in my collar. My breath caught. I closed my eyes, wrapping my large hands around his fragile back, burying my face in his dark hair. God, I loved him. It terrified me how much I loved this boy I hadn't known existed a month ago. When I opened my eyes, I looked toward the house. SJ was standing on the porch, a dish towel gripped tightly in her hands. She was watching us, and for the first time, there was no fear in her eyes, only a deep, shimmering sadness, and something else, a softening, a crack in her impenetrable armor. I held her gaze, silently promising her everything I couldn't say out loud. But later that afternoon, the domestic tranquility of the ranch was broken by a quiet, nagging suspicion. I had been out on the southern ridge, checking a downed fence line, and returned to the main house earlier than expected. I walked quietly through the back door, intending to surprise Leo. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I walked softly down the hallway toward my private study. The door was ajar. I stopped. Peering through the crack, I saw SJ. She wasn't dusting. She wasn't sweeping. She was standing perfectly still in front of my heavy oak desk, staring intensely at the locked drawers. Her head was tilted, her eyes scanning the room with a sharp, calculating focus that didn't belong to a desperate widow looking for cooking work. What the hell is she doing? Before I could say a word, she seemed to hear the floorboard creak under my boot. She jumped, instantly grabbing a feather duster from a nearby table and viciously attacking a bookshelf. I pushed the door open. You don't need to clean in here, Sarah. She whirled around, a flush creeping up her neck. I was just making sure the dust didn't settle on your ledgers, Mr. Thorne. Elias, I corrected, my eyes narrowing. When we're alone, it's Elias. Elias, she repeated, the name sounding like velvet on her tongue. She quickly hurried past me, her shoulder brushing my chest, carrying the scent of lavender and secrets. I watched her walk away, my mind spinning. It wasn't the first odd thing I'd noticed. Just yesterday, I had overheard her talking to Hutch by the woodpile. It hadn't been idle chatter about the weather. She had been asking about the property lines. Specifically, she had asked exactly where the surveyor's markers lay on the North Creek, the primary water source that kept my 3,000 head of cattle alive during the brutal Texas summers. Why does a cook care about my water rights? I walked over to my desk and checked the lock on the bottom drawer. It was secure. Inside that drawer was the original deed to the Thorne Ranch, a piece of paper my grandfather had bled for, and the newly drafted water rights contracts that Silas Vance, a slick city lawyer from Austin, was pushing me to sign. I stared at the locked drawer, the pieces of a puzzle clicking together in my mind, forming a picture I didn't like. Sarah Jane was a brilliant woman. I remembered that from Denver. She had a mind for numbers and a sharp wit that had captivated me just as much as her body. She was too smart to be a simple cook. She was asking about boundaries. She was hovering around my private papers. I clenched my jaw, staring out the window at the dusty horizon. I loved her. I wanted her. I was going to claim her and my son. But as I watched her figure cross the yard to pull sheets from the washing line, a cold, hard realization settled in my gut. Sarah Jane Miller was hiding something massive. And if she thought she could play games with me on my own land, she was about to learn exactly why I was the boss of the Thorne Ranch. I would figure out her secret, and then I would break down the rest of her walls. The oppressive heat of the Texas summer didn't surrender to the night. It just retreated into the walls of the house, leaving the air thick and heavy. Sleep was a luxury I hadn't been able to afford since Sarah Jane stepped off that train. I lay in my bed, a sheet tangled around my waist, staring up at the dark ceiling. The floorboards of the old ranch house creaked as the wood cooled, but beneath those familiar groans, another sound pricked my ears. A sharp, metallic snick. It was faint, but in a house I'd lived in my entire life, any foreign noise was as loud as a gunshot. I slid out of bed, grabbing the Colt revolver resting on my nightstand. I didn't bother with a shirt, stepping barefoot into the dark hallway. I moved with the silent, practiced steps of a man used to hunting in the brush. The sound had come from my study. Through the crack in the heavy oak door, a faint flicker of yellow light danced against the far wall. Someone had lit a match, keeping the flame impossibly low. I nudged the door open with the barrel of my gun, my muscles coiled tight, ready for violence. Kneeling on the floor in front of my desk was a slender silhouette draped in a white cotton nightgown. Her dark hair was loose, tumbling in a wild cascade down her back. In one hand she held a tiny brass hairpin. In the other, a small tension wrench. Sarah Jane. She was picking the lock on my bottom desk drawer. A blinding flash of betrayal ripped through my chest. The questions from the yard, her lingering in the hallway, the sudden appearance of a woman from my past, it all rushed together into a toxic, damning conclusion. She was working for someone else. Silas Vance, perhaps. Someone who had figured out my weakness and sent the mother of my child to exploit it. I stepped fully into the room, letting the heavy door click shut behind me. S.J. froze, the hairpin slipping from the lock with a faint scratch. "If you wanted a raise, Sarah, you just had to ask," I said, my voice dropping into the quiet room like a stone down a deep well. "You didn't have to rob me in the dark." She spun around, dropping the lock-picking tools to the braided rug. In the dim light of the single candle she'd lit on the floor, her face was stark white, her eyes wide with terror. She scrambled backward until her spine hit the mahogany front of my desk. I set the revolver on the nearest bookshelf with a heavy thud, making sure she saw it. Then I crossed the room in 3 long strides, grabbing her by the upper arms and hauling her to her feet. "Who the hell sent you?" I roared, the betrayal making me reckless. I backed her against the desk, trapping her between the hard wood and the solid wall of my chest. Was it Vance? Did he pay you to find the deed? Is that why you brought my son here, as a damn shield? Stop it! Let me go, she hissed, struggling against my grip. But I was immovable, driven by the furious protective instinct of a man whose sanctuary had been breached. Tell me the truth, Sarah, I demanded, shaking her slightly. Or so help me God, I will lock you in this room and put Leo on a train to my sister in Dallas tomorrow morning. That made her stop. The fight vanished, replaced by an inferno of maternal rage. Her dark eyes blazed up at me, fierce and unyielding. You lay one finger on my son, Elias Thorne, and I will burn this ranch to the ground, she spat, her voice trembling with raw fury. I am not stealing from you, you blind, stubborn fool. I'm trying to save you. I paused, my grip loosening marginally, though I didn't step back. Save me from what? From losing everything? She shoved her hands against my chest, putting an inch of space between us. Her chest heaved beneath the thin cotton of her nightgown. Silas Vance isn't just trying to negotiate your water rights, Elias. He's already stolen them, and he's coming for the land next. I stared at her, the adrenaline in my veins stuttering. That's impossible. I have the deed. Vance has been pushing me to sign an easement, but I haven't put ink to paper. He doesn't need you to sign anything, S.J. shot back, her voice dropping to an urgent, desperate whisper. He's already filed a duplicate transfer of deed in Travis County. It transfers the North Creek and 50 acres of the surrounding grazing land to a holding company, a company he controls. How do you know this? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. The pieces were shifting, forming a picture I couldn't quite comprehend. You're a cook, Sarah. You worked a hotel desk. A bitter, humorless smile touched her lips. She reached up, pushing a heavy lock of hair out of her face. I haven't worked a hotel desk since the week after I realized I was carrying your child. I needed a job that paid enough to support 2 people, something that didn't care if a woman was unwed. I took a clerk's exam in Colorado. For the last 2 years, I've been the senior records auditor for the county courthouse. My hands fell away from her arms. I stepped back, feeling as though the floor had suddenly dropped out from under me. A records auditor. I look at paper for a living, Elias, she continued, her tone shifting from a frightened girl to a cold, clinical professional. I look at ink oxidation rates, notary stamp impressions, forged signatures, and artificial paper aging. I was reviewing a cross-state jurisdictional dispute last month, and a holding company registered to a Silas Vance crossed my desk. I recognized the name of the bordering property, the Thorne Ranch. She took a shaky breath, wrapping her arms around her waist. I pulled the file. Vance has filed a deed with a forged signature. Your signature. But to prove it in a federal court, to get an injunction before he forecloses on the water rights and dries out your herd, I need to match the notary stamp and the ink batch against your original uncontested deed. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I stared at the woman standing before me. The fragile, desperate widow I thought I had hired was a phantom. The girl I had slept with 3 years ago had been forged by fire and hardship into a warrior who fought with ink and ledgers instead of bullets and rope. She hadn't come here to beg for my charity. She hadn't come here to trap me with a child. She had come here disguised as a servant to infiltrate my house, break into my desk, and save my family's legacy. Why? The word clawed its way out of my throat, raw and ragged. If you knew all this, why didn't you just write to me? Why the charade? Why pretend to be a cook? S.J. looked down at the floor, the clinical professionalism cracking, revealing the vulnerable, wounded woman beneath. Because I didn't know the man you had become, she whispered. The Elias I knew in Denver was a dream. A wealthy man who bought me dinner and made me feel beautiful for one night. I didn't know if you were a good man. I didn't know if you were the kind of man who would rip my baby out of my arms the second you saw his eyes. If I came to you with a warning, you would have had all the power. I needed leverage. I needed to find the proof myself, secure it, and then hand it to you on my terms. She looked up, a single tear cutting through the dim candlelight. I was terrified of you, Elias, but I couldn't let that monster steal Leo's birthright. This ranch, it belongs to him too. The air left my lungs. Leo's birthright. She had spent years running from me, hiding from me, but when she saw my legacy under threat, she had marched straight into the lion's den to protect what would one day belong to our son. A profound, staggering wave of awe washed over me. I had spent my life surrounded by tough, gritty cowboys who would take a bullet for me. But none of them possessed the sheer, magnificent bravery of the woman standing in my study in a cotton nightgown. I reached into the pocket of my discarded denim trousers on the chair, pulled out a small brass key, and tossed it onto the desk. It clattered loudly against the wood. "Top drawer, left side," I said, my voice thick with emotion. The original deed from 1878, along with every tax record and water survey I've commissioned in the last 5 years. S.J. stared at the key, then up at me, her eyes wide. "You believe me?" "I'd be a fool not to," I replied softly. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us once more. But this time there was no anger, no violence, only a desperate, consuming need to pull her against me. I reached out, my calloused fingers gently brushing the hair back from her face. She shivered at the contact, her dark eyes searching mine. "You don't have to be terrified of me anymore, Sarah," I murmured, my thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "And you don't have to fight in the dark. You're not alone anymore." For a second I thought she might lean into my touch, might let the heavy burden she'd been carrying finally shift onto my shoulders. But then she blinked, the professional armor snapping back into place. She stepped away from my hand, turning toward the desk. "We need to work fast," she said, her voice shaking only slightly as she picked up the key. "Vance is moving quickly. If he finalizes the transfer with the state, reversing it will take years. We have days, maybe less." I watched her unlock the drawer, a bittersweet ache settling in my chest. She was still guarded. She still didn't trust me with her heart. But as I pulled a chair up beside her and lit a second oil lamp, I knew one thing for certain. We were no longer employer and cook. We were partners. And I was going to spend every second of the coming war proving to Sarah Jane that the man she met in Denver wasn't a dream. He was real, and he was hers. The Thorne Ranch house fell into a strange, double-lived rhythm. By day, the charade continued. The sun beat down, the cattle lowed in the distance, and Sarah Jane commanded the kitchen with an iron fist and a flour-dusted apron. She smiled at the ranch hands, served up platters of fried chicken and roasted corn, and kept Leo out from under the horse's hooves. I played my part, barking orders at Hutch, riding the fence lines, and pretending the woman feeding me wasn't the center of my universe. But when the sun went down and the bunkhouse went dark, the real work began. My study became our bunker. Every night after Leo was safely asleep in the back room, S.J. would slip silently down the hallway. We'd draw the heavy velvet curtains, light the oil lamps, and spread my family's history across the massive mahogany desk. It was during these midnight hours that I truly learned who Sarah Jane was. She was a force of nature. Armed with a magnifying glass, a brass ruler, and a notebook full of impossibly neat handwriting, she dismantled Silas Vance's legal trap piece by piece. "Look at this," she said one night, her voice a low, focused murmur. It was past 2 in the morning. The house was dead quiet. I leaned over her shoulder. She was seated in my heavy leather chair, her knees pulled up, a pencil tucked behind her ear. She smelled of vanilla, wood smoke, and that intoxicating lavender. Being this close to her in the intimate glow of the lamplight was a unique kind of torture. "What am I looking at?" I asked, forcing my eyes away from the curve of her neck and down to the papers she had spread out. "The notary stamp on Vance's duplicate deed," she pointed with the tip of a silver letter opener. "Now, look at the stamp on your original tax filing from 3 years ago. The one notarized by the same clerk in town." I squinted. "They look the same." "They aren't." She tapped the paper. Notice the depth of the ink on the outer ring of Vance's document. It's heavier on the right side. That means the person stamping it applied uneven pressure. A clerk who stamps 50 documents a day has a fluid, balanced motion. The only time you see uneven pressure like this is when someone is nervous, or when they are using a stolen stamp they aren't accustomed to handling. I stared at her, genuinely astounded. You can see all that from a smudge of ink? I can see a man going to federal prison, she corrected, a fierce, triumphant light dancing in her dark eyes. Vance didn't just forge your signature, Elias. He bought off or stole the stamp from the county clerk. If we can prove the stamp was misused, the deed is voided. You're a terrifying woman, S.J., I chuckled, a deep rumble of genuine admiration. She paused, looking up at me over her shoulder. The playful light in her eyes faded, replaced by something softer, something that made my breath catch. You need a terrifying woman to keep a place like this. The air in the study suddenly felt thick, heavy with the weight of the things we weren't saying. The 3 years of absence, the child sleeping down the hall, the undeniable electric pull that crackled between us every time we occupied the same space. I know I do, I murmured, my gaze dropping to her lips. S.J. swallowed hard, her eyes darting away. She quickly turned back to the desk, shuffling a stack of papers with nervous energy. We still need to find out how Vance got a perfect copy of your signature to trace. Your signature on this forged deed is flawless. He couldn't have done that from memory. He had to have a source document. Something you signed recently. I leaned back against the edge of the desk, crossing my arms to keep from reaching for her. I sign a dozen checks and supply manifests a week. Anyone in town could have gotten their hands on one. It's not a check, S.J. insisted, her brow furrowed in concentration. Signatures on checks are rushed. This signature has the fluid, complete strokes of a formal document. Someone gave Vance a clean, formal copy of your signature, Elias. Someone close to you. A cold chill washed over the back of my neck. You're saying I have a rat on my payroll. I'm saying Vance is a careful man, she replied, looking up at me. He wouldn't leave a paper trail if he didn't have inside help. Who handles your paperwork when you're out on the range? Nobody. I do it all myself. I frowned, mentally running through my crew. Hutch goes into town to pick up supplies and drop off the mail, but he can barely read, let alone orchestrate a land fraud. S.J. tapped her pencil against her notebook, her expression troubled. We need to be careful, Elias. If Vance has someone inside the ranch, they might notice what we're doing. They might realize I'm not just a cook. Let them, I growled, a surge of possessive anger flaring in my chest. If anyone looks at you sideways, I'll break their jaw. Violence won't solve this, she sighed, rubbing her temples. She looked exhausted. The shadows under her eyes were growing darker with every sleepless night, her delicate frame seeming too fragile to carry the weight of my family's future. You need to sleep, I said gently, reaching out and gently taking the pencil from her hand. I can't. Not until I finish cross-referencing the state statutes on water rights. If we take this to the federal judge, the brief has to be bulletproof. The brief can wait until tomorrow, I insisted. I placed my hands on the armrests of her chair, leaning in close. You're working yourself into the ground, Sarah. For me. She looked up, her dark eyes locking onto mine. The distance between us was nothing more than a few inches. I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, could see the slight parted shape of her lips. Not just for you, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. For Leo. And what about you? I asked, my voice dropping to a rough, gravelly rasp. What do you get out of this, S.J.? When Vance is locked up and the ranch is safe, what happens to you? She stared at me, a myriad of emotions flashing across her face, fear, longing, uncertainty. I have a job, a contract. I tore that contract up the day you arrived, and you know it. I shifted my hands, moving them from the chair to her waist. She gasped softly as my fingers gripped her hips. pulling her slightly forward until her knees bracketed my thighs. "Elias?" she breathed, a warning that held no actual resistance. "Tell me," I demanded, my thumb tracing the curve of her hip through the thin cotton of her skirt. "Tell me you didn't just come here for the paper. Tell me you didn't think about Denver every day for the last 3 years, just like I did." "It doesn't matter what I thought," she choked out, a tear finally escaping and tracking down her cheek. I can't do this, Elias. I can't let myself fall back into this. If I lose my focus, if Vance wins, I lose everything." "You aren't going to lose," I said fiercely, bringing one hand up to cup her face. I wiped the tear away with my thumb, my eyes burning into hers. "Because I am standing right beside you. I am in this trench with you, Sarah. You don't have to carry the whole damn world by yourself anymore." A sob broke loose from her throat. The thick, impenetrable armor she had worn since the day she arrived finally shattered. Her hands came up, grabbing the front of my shirt in a desperate, white-knuckled grip. "I was so tired," she confessed, the words pouring out like a broken dam. "I was so tired of being strong. I was so tired of being alone." "You're not alone," I swore. "Never again." I didn't wait for permission. I leaned down and captured her lips with mine. The kiss was an explosion. 3 years of repressed longing, anger, fear, and desperate love ignited the second our mouths met. SJ let out a soft, surrendered moan, her hands sliding up my chest to tangle in my hair. I pulled her up out of the chair, wrapping my arms tightly around her waist, lifting her off the floor until we were pressed flush against each other. She tasted of coffee and vanilla and something wild and sweet that belonged entirely to her. She kissed me back with a ferocious hunger, her mouth opening to mine, taking everything I offered and demanding more. I backed her up against the heavy mahogany desk, scattering the forged deeds and legal ledgers, not giving a damn about Silas Vance or water rights or anything else in the world, except the woman in my arms. My hands roamed her back, pulling her closer, trying to absorb her into my very skin. I kissed her jaw, her neck, breathing in the scent of her. She arched against me, her fingers gripping my shoulders like I was the only solid thing keeping her from drowning. When we finally broke apart, we were both gasping for air. I rested my forehead against hers, my chest heaving, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. SJ kept her eyes closed, her hands still resting on my chest, feeling the frantic beat of my heart. "Vance is going to pay," I whispered fiercely against her lips. "I am going to destroy him for trying to take my home. And then I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to run again." She opened her eyes. They were dark, dilated, and shining with a fierce, beautiful light. She didn't say yes. She didn't have to. For the first time since a cold morning in Denver, I knew exactly where I belonged. The war wasn't over. The enemy was still circling, but standing there in the dim lamplight with Sarah Jane in my arms. I knew one thing for absolute certain. Silas Vance didn't stand a chance in hell. The morning after our midnight revelation, the air in the ranch house felt entirely different. It wasn't just the suffocating Texas heat pressing through the window panes. It was a charged electric current that snapped between Sarah Jane and me every time we occupied the same room. I sat at the head of the heavy oak breakfast table, nursing a cup of black coffee, watching her move. She was frying bacon at the cast-iron stove, her dark hair pinned up neatly, the picture of domestic duty. But every time she turned to bring a platter to the table, her dark eyes flicked to mine, heavily laden with the memory of what had happened against my desk. The ghost of my hands on her waist, the taste of her mouth. It hung in the air, thick and intoxicating. "You're staring, Elias," she murmured, setting a plate of biscuits down near my elbow. Her voice was kept low so the ranch hands eating on the porch wouldn't hear. "I'm admiring my view," I replied, keeping my voice just as quiet. I reached out under the table, my fingers briefly brushing against the fabric of her skirt, grazing her knee. She inhaled sharply, a faint flush creeping up her neck before she quickly retreated to the stove. Today was the midsummer festival in town. A rare day off for the crew, a day of horse races, pie tasting, and excessive whiskey drinking. Normally, I would ride in with the men, conduct a little business at the bank, and head home early. But today was different. "Get Leo dressed," I told her, finishing my coffee and standing up. "We're taking the wagon into town." SJ paused, the spatula hovering over the skillet. "Elias, I'm the cook. I shouldn't—" "You're not the cook today," I interrupted, my tone leaving no room for argument. I stepped into her space, uncaring if Hutch or Billy walked in. I reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Today, you're the woman I'm courting, and Leo is coming with us." Her eyes widened, a mixture of panic and hope flashing in those dark depths. "People will talk. They'll look at him. They'll look at his eyes." "Let them," I said fiercely. "I'm done hiding in the shadows of my own life, Sarah. He's a thorn. It's about time the county knew it." An hour later, the three of us were in the buckboard heading toward town. Leo was vibrating with toddler energy, bouncing on SJ's lap, pointing at every hawk and jackrabbit we passed. I drove the team with a relaxed grip, feeling a profound, unfamiliar sense of peace. For 3 years, I had built my empire on dust and solitude. Now, listening to the light, musical sound of SJ's laughter as Leo babbled, I realized I had been building a kingdom without a queen. The town of Red Creek was swarming. Bunting hung from the saloons, and the main street was choked with wagons, horses, and ranchers in their Sunday best. I helped SJ down from the wagon, my hands lingering on her waist a second longer than necessary, before swinging Leo up onto my shoulders. The boy gripped my Stetson with sticky fingers, letting out a triumphant shriek. As we walked down the wooden boardwalk, the reaction of the town was palpable. Conversations halted. Cowboys tipped their hats, but their eyes lingered on SJ's striking beauty, then darted up to the boy perched on my shoulders. I saw the exact moment the realization hit the gossiping ladies outside the mercantile. They saw the jawline. They saw those icy gray eyes. I didn't flinch. I kept my chin high, my hand resting firmly on the small of SJ's back, guiding her through the crowd. I was claiming them without saying a single word. We spent an hour at the festival grounds. I bought Leo a stick of peppermint candy that ended up smeared across his face and my shirt collar. I watched SJ smile, truly, freely smile, as she watched a troupe of traveling acrobats. For a brief, shining moment, the forged deeds and the looming threat of Silas Vance vanished. We were just a family. But a man like Silas Vance doesn't let the sun shine on his enemies for long. We were standing near the lemonade stall when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. A shadow fell over the bright afternoon. Well, well, Elias Thorne playing the family man. A rare sight indeed. I turned slowly. Standing a few feet away, flanked by 2 burly, mean-looking hired guns, was Silas Vance. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most men in this town made in a year. A gold pocket watch gleaming against his vest. He was a slick, handsome man, but his eyes were entirely dead, the eyes of a shark smelling blood in the water. I immediately stepped in front of SJ, shielding her and Leo with my body. My muscles coiled tight, my right hand hovering instinctively near the Colt strapped to my hip. "Vance," I acknowledged, my voice dripping with ice, "what brings a city rat out into the sun?" Vance chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He took a step closer, his eyes flicking over my shoulder to SJ. "Just inspecting my investments. Red Creek is a charming town. It has so much potential." He tipped his expensive bowler hat. "And who is this lovely creature? I heard you hired a new cook, Elias, but the rumors didn't do her justice." "Keep your eyes off her," I growled, taking a half-step forward. Vance held up his hands in mock surrender, but his gaze dropped to the toddler clinging to my leg. Leo stared back at him, unimpressed, his gray eyes cold and unblinking. Vance's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He saw the resemblance. A smart man like him wouldn't miss it. "Fascinating," Vance murmured, his voice dropping an octave. "You know, Elias, a man with a legacy like yours has to be careful. The frontier is a dangerous place. Fires break out. Dams burst. Sometimes people just disappear. It would be a terrible tragedy if something were to happen to your new, fragile little family before you had the chance to sign those water rights over to me. The blood roared in my ears. The veiled threat against S.J. and Leo snapped the last shred of my restraint. I moved faster than a striking rattlesnake. In one fluid motion, I grabbed Vance by the lapels of his expensive suit and slammed him backward against the wooden siding of the lemonade stall. The wood groaned under the impact. His two bodyguards reached for their weapons, but I already had my Colt drawn and pressed directly under Vance's chin. The busy street around us erupted into panicked screams. People scattered. "Draw your weapons and your boss loses his head," I barked at the two thugs. They froze, hands hovering over their holsters. I pressed the barrel harder against Vance's jaw. He was breathing fast, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple, but that arrogant smirk was still plastered on his face. "You threaten my family again," I whispered, my voice a demonic rasp. "And I won't wait for a judge, Vance. I will drag you out into the desert, gut you like a pig, and let the buzzards finish the paperwork. Do you understand me?" "Elias, stop!" S.J.'s hands gripped my left arm, her fingers digging into my muscle. "Elias, look at me." I didn't want to look at her. I wanted to pull the trigger. The urge to extinguish the threat to my son was primal and overwhelming. "Elias," she pleaded, stepping between me and the thugs, placing herself directly in the line of fire. "If you kill him now in front of half the town, they'll hang you. And he wins. We lose the ranch. Leo loses his father. Put the gun down. We beat him our way." Her words pierced through the red haze of my fury. Leo loses his father. My jaw clamped shut so hard my teeth ground together. I stared into Vance's terrified eyes for one more second, making sure he saw the absolute promise of death residing there. Slowly, I lowered the hammer of the Colt. I shoved Vance away, letting him stumble into the dust. "Get off my land, Vance," I snarled, holstering my weapon, "and stay the hell away from my family." Vance scrambled to his feet, brushing the dirt from his suit, his face pale but twisted with venom. "You're a dead man, Thorne," he spat. "You and your bastard brat. Enjoy the water while you have it." He turned and stalked away, his goons trailing behind him. The town was dead silent, every eye fixed on us. I turned to S.J. She was trembling, holding Leo tightly to her chest. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders, pulling them both against my side. "We're going home," I said loudly, daring anyone in the crowd to say a word. The wagon ride back to the ranch was entirely different from the morning. The joy had evaporated, replaced by a grim, suffocating reality. Vance wasn't just playing a legal game anymore. He had seen S.J. He had seen Leo. The stakes had just escalated from paper and ink to flesh and blood. He was going to try to destroy me, and he wouldn't care who got caught in the crossfire. As the iron gates of the Thorne Ranch came into view, I made a silent vow. Silas Vance wanted a war. I was going to give him one he wouldn't survive. That night, the heat broke, but it wasn't a relief. It was a suffocating, heavy stillness that usually preceded a violent Texas thunderstorm. But there were no clouds in the sky, only a sea of indifferent stars. I doubled the night watch. I pulled Hutch aside by the stables and gave him explicit orders. "I want 2 men on the ridge, 2 riding the southern perimeter, and nobody sleeps near the North Creek. Shoot any trespasser on sight. Vance is getting desperate." Hutch spit a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt, his weathered face grim. "You got it, boss. Ain't no city slicker getting past my boys." I nodded, clapping him on the shoulder before heading into the house. Inside, the lamps were turned down low. I found S.J. in the study, pacing in front of my desk. She had changed out of her festival dress into her simple cotton nightgown and a heavy wool shawl. "He knows," she said the moment I walked in, rubbing her arms as if she were freezing despite the heat. "Vance knows we're building a case. He saw it in your eyes today. He knows you aren't going to roll over." "Let him know," I said, walking over and pulling her into my arms. She melted against my chest, her anxiety radiating into my skin. The federal judge in Austin owes my father a favor. If we can get your brief and the evidence on the train by Friday, the marshal will have Vance in irons by Monday. Friday is 3 days away, Elias. Men like Vance don't wait 3 days. I have guards posted. We're safe. I kissed the top of her head, trying to project a certainty I didn't entirely feel. We eventually went to bed, though sleep was a fractured, elusive thing. I lay in the dark, listening to SJ's soft, even breathing beside me. Having her in my bed felt like a miracle I hadn't earned, a piece of heaven dropped into the middle of a war zone. But my hand never strayed far from the Colt resting on the nightstand. It happened at 2 in the morning. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a deep, guttural roar that vibrated through the floorboards, followed by a concussive shockwave that rattled the glass in the window panes. SJ bolted upright with a gasp. What was that? I was already out of bed, pulling on my denim trousers and boots. Dynamite. I grabbed my Winchester rifle from the corner cabinet and shoved my revolver into its holster. Stay here, I barked, tossing her a loaded double-barreled shotgun. SJ caught it clumsily, her eyes wide with terror. Elias, lock the door. Barricade it with the dresser. Do not open it for anyone except me. If anyone else tries to come through that door, you pull both triggers. Do you understand me, Sarah? Leo, she choked out, already running toward the back room where our son was sleeping. Protect him, I swore, kissing her hard, tasting fear and adrenaline. I will be back. I bolted out of the house, sprinting across the yard toward the bunkhouse. The ranch was in chaos. Men were spilling out into the dark, pulling on suspenders and racking rifles. North Creek, Hutch yelled, pointing toward the ridge. A sickly orange glow was rising against the night sky, illuminating the rolling hills. Saddle up, I roared, throwing myself onto the bare back of my closest stallion. We rode like demons through the dark brush, the smell of sulfur and burning timber growing stronger with every mile. As we crested the ridge, the devastation laid out below us made my stomach drop. The earthen dam holding back the North Creek, the lifeblood of my entire operation, had been blown to hell. Water was rushing through the jagged crater, flooding the lower valley, churning up mud and drowning the grazing pastures. Debris from the wooden sluice gates was on fire, casting demonic dancing shadows across the churning water. Worse than the water, though, were the cattle. A herd of 300 longhorns, spooked by the explosion and the fire, had stampeded. They were trapped in the muddy basin, thrashing and bellowing in pure terror, crushing each other in their panic. Get the herd turned, I screamed over the roar of the water and the fire. Hutch, take 5 men and cut off the south pass. Keep them out of the deep mud. It was pure, unadulterated hell. We rode into the fray, firing our pistols into the air to turn the stampede. The heat from the burning timber was blistering. I spurred my horse forward, trying to cut off a group of calves headed straight for the rushing floodwater. Yeah, get up, I shouted, swinging my rope. Suddenly, a secondary blast. A forgotten stick of dynamite buried in the timber detonated near the bank. My horse reared up with a terrified scream. I fought the reins, but a massive chunk of splintered wood flew through the air, striking me hard in the side of the head. The world flashed blinding white, then pitched into dizzying darkness. I felt myself slipping from the horse, hitting the wet mud with a bone-jarring thud. Hooves thundered past my head, mud kicked into my eyes. For a terrifying second, I thought I was going to be trampled to death by my own herd. But pure, stubborn survival instinct kicked in. I rolled hard to the right, scrambling up against the trunk of a massive oak tree, just as a terrified steer barreled past where my head had been. I pressed my hand to my forehead. It came away slick and hot with blood. The world was spinning, my vision blurred by the blood running into my left eye. Boss! Billy, one of the young hands, rode up, hauling back on his reins. Boss, you're hit! I'm fine, I yelled back, staggering to my feet and grabbing the reins of my horse, pulling myself back up into the saddle. The pain was excruciating, a pounding drum behind my eyes, but I pushed it down. Get those stragglers moving! It took 2 hours to turn the herd and get the fires under control. By the time we were finished, the sun was just beginning to peek over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in a mocking shade of peaceful pink. The dam was gone. The water was draining out into the deadlands. If we didn't fix it in a week, my cattle would die of thirst. Silas Vance hadn't just tried to scare me, he had tried to bankrupt me overnight. I rode back to the main house, my body aching, my head throbbing in rhythm with my heartbeat. The left side of my face was a mask of dried blood and mud. When I reached the porch, I didn't even have to knock. The heavy oak door swung open, and SJ was there. She still had the shotgun gripped in one hand, Leo clinging to her hip with the other. When she saw me, she dropped the gun. It clattered loudly on the floorboards. "Elias!" she sobbed, rushing forward. I caught her with one arm, burying my face in her neck, too exhausted to hold myself up completely. I'm okay. I'm okay." She pulled back, her hands trembling as she touched the edges of the gash on my forehead. "You're bleeding. Oh, God, you're bleeding so much." "It's just a graze," I lied, letting her pull me inside and push me down into a kitchen chair. She barked an order I didn't catch, and within seconds she was pressing a cold, wet rag against my head, cleaning away the blood and the mud. Her touch was incredibly gentle. Her dark eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Leo stood by my knee, patting my dusty thigh with a worried frown. "They blew the dam," I said numbly, staring at the floorboards. "Vance sent men to blow it." "We can rebuild it," she said fiercely, washing the wound. "We have the evidence, Elias. We'll send it to Austin tomorrow." I closed my eyes, the cold water stinging my flesh. But as the adrenaline faded, a cold, creeping realization began to take root in my mind. I opened my eyes, looking past SJ to the window. The North Creek was heavily guarded. I had explicitly ordered Hutch to put 2 men on the ridge overlooking the dam. The bombers would have had to ride in with a wagon full of dynamite, set the charges, and light the fuses. It wasn't a quiet job, it wasn't a fast job. There was absolutely no way Vance's thugs could have bypassed my night watch without being seen, unless they knew exactly where the guards were, unless they knew the patrol schedules. And only 2 men knew the patrol schedules, me and the man who assigned them. "Sarah," I whispered, the blood in my veins turning to ice. She stopped, the rag hovering over my forehead. "What is it?" "Get the papers," I said, my voice hoarse. "Get the ledgers, the forged deed, the brief you wrote. Everything. Pack it all in your canvas bag." "Elias, what's wrong?" I looked up at her, the horrific truth settling heavy and cold in my chest. Silas Vance had known exactly where to strike. He had known my signature well enough to trace it. He had known my patrol routes. "Vance didn't beat my guards," I said quietly, gripping her wrist. "He bought them. The call came from inside the house. There was a traitor on the Thorn Ranch. And I was looking right at the man who had the keys to my kingdom, Hutch. The realization that Hutch, the man who had ridden beside me through blizzards, droughts, and stampedes, was the rat eating away at my foundation was a poison that seeped into my very marrow. I didn't tell Sarah Jane immediately. I couldn't form the words. I sat at the kitchen table while she bandaged my head, staring blankly at the wood grain, calculating how a man I trusted with my life could sell it for silver. But as the morning sun climbed higher, casting a harsh light over the devastated North Creek, the anger replaced the shock. A cold, calculating fury settled in my chest. If Silas Vance had bought my foreman, he had a direct line to every move I made. But a two-way street worked both ways. I could use Hutch to feed Vance exactly what I wanted him to hear. I found SJ in the back bedroom, packing her canvas bag with frantic, shaking hands. Leo was sitting on the bed, quietly playing with the wooden horse I'd carved him. "Stop," I said gently, catching her hands. "You aren't leaving. Elias, if Vance has someone inside the ranch—" "I know who it is," I interrupted, my voice devoid of emotion. "It's Hutch. He's the only one who knew the patrol routes. He's the only one who handles the mail and supply runs to town. He had access to my checks to trace the signature." SJ froze, the color draining from her face. "Your foreman? Elias? He's been with you for a decade." And now he's going to hang, I replied flatly. But first, we're going to use him to break Vance. I laid out the plan. It was simple, dangerous, and required SJ to possess nerves of steel. She didn't blink, she just nodded, her dark eyes hardening into obsidian. At noon, I called the crew together by the bunkhouse. The men were exhausted, covered in mud and soot from the dam explosion. Hutch stood near the front, a perfectly executed expression of grim determination on his weathered face. It made me want to draw my Colt and shoot him where he stood. "Listen up," I barked, projecting my voice over the exhausted murmurs. "Vance hit us hard last night. He thinks he crippled us, but he made a mistake. He left me alive, and he left my records intact." I paused, making sure every man was looking at me, especially my foreman. "Tomorrow morning at first light, Sarah Jane and I are taking the wagon to Austin. She's compiled a full federal brief proving Vance forged the deeds and blew our dam. We are handing the original documents and the forensic evidence directly to a federal marshal. Hutch, you're in charge of the ranch until I return. Keep the men on the South Ridge." Hutch nodded solemnly. "You got it, boss. Have a safe ride. We'll hold the fort." The lie tasted like ash in my mouth. "I know you will." The trap was set. If Hutch was Vance's man, he couldn't let those documents leave the ranch tomorrow. He had to destroy them tonight. Night fell with agonizing slowness. I sent SJ and Leo to my bedroom on the second floor, instructing her to lock the heavy oak door and keep the shotgun loaded. Then I went down to the study. I stacked a pile of useless old ledgers and blank parchment on my desk, arranging them to look like a meticulously prepared legal brief. I placed the leather folder containing the original deed squarely on top. Then I extinguished the oil lamp, retreated to the darkest corner of the room behind a towering bookshelf, and waited. The hours crawled by. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, then 1, then 2. My muscles cramped, the wound on my head throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache, but I barely felt it. I was a hunter in a blind, waiting for the predator to step into the clearing. At 2:15, the floorboards in the hallway groaned. It was a sound so familiar I usually slept right through it. The handle of the study door turned with agonizing slowness. The door pushed open, revealing a sliver of pale moonlight from the hall. A shadow slipped into the room. He moved with the practiced stealth of a cowboy, his boots making almost no sound on the rug. In his left hand, he carried a heavy iron crowbar. In his right, a tin canister. The sharp, acrid smell of kerosene instantly flooded the enclosed space. Hutch stepped up to the mahogany desk. He didn't bother lighting a match yet. He unscrewed the cap of the canister and began to douse the stack of decoy papers. "Tell me how much you sold me for, Hutch." My voice cut through the dark like a cracking whip. Hutch violently jerked, dropping the canister. It clattered against the floorboards, kerosene spilling out in a dark puddle. He spun around, raising the crowbar instinctively, his eyes wide with panicked terror in the dim moonlight. "Boss," he stammered, his chest heaving, I was just checking the perimeter. Smelled something funny." "You smell kerosene, you son of a bitch, because you just poured it all over my desk." I stepped out from the shadows, the silver barrel of my Colt revolver catching the moonlight. I pointed it directly at his chest. "How much? Did Vance pay off your gambling debts in Fort Worth? Is that what my father's legacy was worth to you? A bad hand of poker?" Hutch's face twisted, the facade dropping. The terror morphed into a cornered, ugly desperation. "You don't understand, Elias. He had me by the throat. The men I owed, they were going to kill me. Vance found out. He offered to wipe the slate clean. All he wanted was a clean copy of your signature and the patrol schedules. So you helped him steal my water. You helped him blow my dam, risking the lives of the men you sleep next to every night," I roared, the betrayal finally boiling over. "He promised nobody would get hurt," Hutch yelled back, his grip tightening on the crowbar. "He just wanted to dry you out so you'd sell. And then you had to bring that woman here." She started snooping. Vance panicked. "He said if those papers made it to Austin, we'd both hang." He was right, I said coldly, pulling the hammer back on the Colt with a sharp click. "Drop the iron, Hutch." But a desperate man with nothing to lose is a dangerous animal. Hutch let out a primal yell and lunged across the desk, swinging the heavy iron crowbar directly at my head. I ducked, the iron smashing into the bookshelf behind me, raining splintered wood and heavy leather-bound books down on my shoulders. I tackled him around the waist, driving us both to the floor. The Colt skittered out of my hand, sliding under the desk. It was a brutal, ugly fight. There was no honor in it, just two men fighting in the dark. Hutch punched me squarely in my wounded temple, sending a blinding flash of white agony through my skull. I tasted blood, but the fury in my veins made me impervious to the pain. I rolled, pinning him beneath me, and brought my fist down across his jaw with a sickening crunch. He thrashed, trying to gouge my eyes, but I caught his wrist, twisting it sharply until he cried out, the fight finally draining out of him. I dragged him up by his shirt collar, slamming him against the wall, my forearm pressed crushing against his windpipe. "You're done," I panted, my face inches from his bloody one. "You're done." I bound his hands and feet with heavy rope from the mudroom and dragged him into the pantry, locking the heavy door from the outside. When the adrenaline finally began to ebb, the physical and emotional toll slammed into me like a runaway freight train. I stood in the middle of my ruined study, staring at the kerosene-soaked desk, my knuckles split and bleeding. My oldest friend had betrayed me. My ranch was crippled. I felt a profound, suffocating exhaustion pulling me toward the floor. "Elias," I turned. SJ was standing in the doorway holding a flickering oil lamp. She had heard the fight. She saw the blood on my face, the ruined room, the despair in my posture. She didn't ask questions. She set the lamp down, crossed the room, and wrapped her arms tightly around my waist, pressing her face against my chest. I collapsed against her, burying my face in her hair, my hands gripping her trembling shoulders. She held me with a fierce, quiet strength, absorbing my grief, anchoring me to the earth when my entire world felt like it was tearing apart. "We got him," she whispered against my heart. "The snake is out of the grass." "Tomorrow," I swore, pulling her closer, breathing in her scent to banish the smell of kerosene and blood. "Tomorrow we finished Silas Vance for good." The morning sun rose over the Thorn Ranch, casting a brilliant, mocking light on the exhaustion etched into the faces of my crew. They had spent the night trying to patch the shattered dam, completely unaware that the man who had caused the destruction was currently tied up in the kitchen pantry. I stood on the wide front porch, a steaming mug of black coffee in my left hand, a loaded Winchester rifle leaning against the railing within arm's reach. My knuckles were wrapped in white bandages, and a fresh dressing covered my forehead. I felt like a man walking to the gallows, but my mind was crystal clear. SJ stepped out through the screen door, carrying a plate of eggs she couldn't eat. She stood beside me, her shoulder brushing my arm. There was no fear in her dark eyes this morning, only a terrifying, magnificent calm. She was a general surveying a battlefield she had meticulously rigged with explosives. "Dust on the road," I noted, my eyes fixed on the horizon. A black buggy, flanked by 4 men on horseback, was rolling fast up the long dirt driveway toward the main house. The gold star of the county sheriff caught the morning light on the chest of the lead rider. "He's early," SJ murmured, sipping her coffee. "He thinks Hutch succeeded. He thinks the evidence is burned. And you're broken." "Let's see how broken he thinks I am." I set my mug down and picked up the Winchester, holding it casually across my chest. The buggy pulled to a halt at the edge of the yard. The sheriff, a bloated, corrupt man named Wilkins, whose pockets had been lined by Vance's money for years, dismounted heavily. Silas Vance stepped out of the buggy. He was dressed impeccably, a stark contrast to the mud and blood of my ranch. A smug, victorious smile played on his lips. "Morning, Elias," Vance called out, adjusting his lapels. "Looks like you had a rough night. Heard about the tragic accident at the dam. A real shame." "Get off my land, Silas," I said, my voice carrying over the quiet yard. Several of my ranch hands, sensing the tension, had stopped their work and were slowly gathering near the bunkhouse, hands resting on their holsters. Vance chuckled, stepping forward. "I'm afraid I can't do that. As of 9 o'clock this morning, the Travis County Court formally recognized the transfer of the North Creek and the surrounding acreage to the Brazos Holding Company. And since you've clearly mismanaged the property and endangered the herd, the bank has called in the remainder of your father's notes." Sheriff Wilkins pulled a folded piece of paper from his vest. "I got a foreclosure and seizure order right here, Thorne. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises. The land, the water, and the herd now belong to Mr. Vance." "You're welcome to try and take it, Wilkins." I racked the lever of the Winchester. The metallic clack-clack echoed loudly in the morning air. Behind me, I heard the click of a dozen revolvers as my crew stepped forward, loyal to the end, ready to die for the Thorne brand. Vance's smile faltered for a second, but his arrogance quickly covered it. "Don't be a fool, Elias. If you shoot a sheriff, you'll hang. I know you are planning a desperate little trip to Austin today with some forged evidence to try and delay the inevitable. But my sources tell me there was a terrible fire in your study last night. All those precious papers, gone up in smoke." He looked at S.J., his eyes glittering with malice. "You should pack your bags, sweetheart. Though if you need a new employer, I might have a position for a pretty cook in town." S.J. didn't flinch. She stepped forward, moving in front of me, placing herself between the barrel of my rifle and Silas Vance. She smoothed the front of her simple cotton dress, her posture radiating absolute authority. "I won't be needing a job, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice ringing out clear and sharp. "And neither will you unless they pay inmates to stamp license plates in federal prison." Vance scoffed. "And what does the cook know about federal law?" "More than a two-bit thief who buys a county clerk's notary stamp," S.J. shot back, her eyes narrowing. "You thought you were clever, Silas. You thought because you paid off Hutch, you held all the cards. You thought the papers in the study were your death warrant." Vance's smugness finally cracked. His eyes darted to the study window, then back to S.J. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that I am not a cook," S.J. stated, her voice slicing through his arrogance like a razor. "My name is Sarah Jane Miller. I am the senior records auditor for the state of Colorado, and you fell for the oldest trick in the book. The papers Hutch poured kerosene on last night were blank ledgers." Vance took a step back, his face draining of color. Sheriff Wilkins looked nervously between the two of us. "Where are they?" Vance demanded, his voice pitching higher. "They aren't here," S.J. smiled, a cold, ruthless expression that made my heart swell with pride. "The original deed, the forged duplicate, the ink analysis, and Hutch's written confession from an hour ago. I put them on a train to Austin myself 3 days ago. They were delivered directly to the desk of Federal Judge Harrison Hargrove, a man who owes Elias's father his career, and a man who despises corrupt lawyers." "You're bluffing," Vance spat, sweat beading on his forehead. "You're a lying bitch." "Am I?" S.J. tilted her head, gesturing toward the long driveway. We all turned. A second cloud of dust was billowing up the road. 3 riders were pushing their horses at a dead gallop. As they grew closer, the morning sun glinted off the silver badges pinned to their dust-covered coats. "United States Federal Marshals." "Sheriff Wilkins!" the lead marshal bellowed as he pulled his horse to a sliding stop, drawing his weapon and aiming it squarely at the corrupt county lawman. "Drop your weapon. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud." He turned his steely gaze to Silas Vance, who was currently looking like a man who had just swallowed glass. "Silas Vance, I have a federal warrant for your arrest. Put your hands where I can see 'em." Vance looked at the marshals, then at the drawn guns of my crew, and finally back at S.J. The realization that his entire empire had been dismantled by a woman he had dismissed as a servant shattered him completely. He dropped to his knees in the dirt, raising his hands. S.J. turned around and looked at me. The fierce, untouchable auditor vanished, replaced by the woman I loved. She offered me a soft, exhausted smile. "Checkmate," she whispered. I dropped the Winchester, grabbed her around the waist, and kissed her right there on the front porch in front of the federal marshals, the arrested criminals, and my cheering crew. I kissed her until we were both breathless, pouring every ounce of my gratitude, respect, and overwhelming love into her. Silas Vance thought he could steal my kingdom. He didn't realize he had declared war on the Queen. The dust took a few weeks to truly settle, both literally and figuratively. Silas Vance and Sheriff Wilkins were transported to a federal penitentiary, awaiting a trial that Judge Hargrove promised would be swift and merciless. Hutch was taken with them. When the marshals hauled him out of the pantry, he couldn't look me in the eye. I didn't say a word to him. The Brotherhood was dead, buried under the mud of the North Creek. Rebuilding the dam took the grueling labor of every man on the payroll, plus a dozen hands I hired from town. But the water was flowing clean again, the herd was safe, and the bank, terrified by the federal investigation, had immediately backed off my father's notes. The Thorn Ranch was secure. But as I stood on the porch one golden late summer evening, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in violent strokes of violet and gold, I knew the land wasn't the most important thing I had secured. I listened to the sounds coming through the open kitchen window. Leo was giggling wildly, the sound bouncing off the wooden walls. SJ was singing softly, a folk song she used to hum in Denver. The smell of roasting beef and fresh-baked blackberry pie drifted out onto the porch, a scent that had become synonymous with home. I wiped the grease and dirt from my hands with a rag and walked through the screen door. SJ was standing at the stove, her dark hair escaping its pins, a smudge of flour on her cheek. She was wearing that faded cotton dress and the heavy canvas apron she put on every single morning. Leo was sitting on the floor, banging two wooden spoons together in an offbeat rhythm. When I walked in, SJ turned, her face lighting up with a smile that still knocked the breath right out of my lungs. "You're just in time," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Dinner is almost ready. How did the repairs on the south fence go?" I didn't answer. I walked across the kitchen, stopping inches from her. I looked down into her dark, beautiful eyes. The shadows of exhaustion and fear that had haunted her since the day she stepped off the train were completely gone. She looked radiant. She looked at peace. "Elias?" she asked, her smile faltering slightly at my intense expression. "Is everything all right?" "No," I said quietly. Her brow furrowed in immediate concern. I reached around her waist. My calloused fingers found the knot of the heavy canvas apron tied at the small of her back. I pulled the string, loosening the knot. "What are you doing?" she breathed, her hands coming up to rest on my chest. "I'm firing you," I said softly. I pulled the apron off her shoulders, letting it fall to the kitchen floor in a heap of dusty canvas. SJ stared up at me, her lips parted in surprise. "Firing me?" "You're a terrible cook, Sarah Jane," I murmured, bringing my hands up to cup her face. My thumbs gently stroked her cheekbones. "You burn the bacon half the time because you're busy reading legal statutes. You let my son eat jam before dinner. And you've driven every single man on my payroll to distraction." A soft, watery laugh escaped her lips. "I kept you alive." "You did more than that," I swore, the playful banter fading into absolute soul-deep sincerity. "You saved my legacy. You brought my son back to me. You walked into the fires of hell to protect a man you had every right to hate." "I never hated you, Elias," she whispered, a tear spilling over her lashes and landing on my thumb. "I was just scared." "You don't ever have to be scared again." I leaned my forehead against hers, closing my eyes, letting the reality of her presence wash over me. "I don't need a cook, Sarah. I don't need an auditor. I need a wife. I need the woman who holds my heart in her hands to promise she's never going to run away again. I need you." SJ let out a choked sob, her arms wrapping tightly around my neck, pulling herself flush against my body. "I'm not running," she cried softly against my shoulder. "I'm exactly where I belong. Yes, Elias, yes." I kissed her, a slow, deep, devastating promise of a kiss. It held all the passion of that night in Denver, the desperation of the midnight lock-picking, and the profound peace of a war finally won. A loud clack broke us apart. We looked down. Leo had hit my boot with his wooden spoon, looking up at us with his icy gray eyes, clearly annoyed that we had stopped paying attention to his drumming. I laughed, a rich booming sound from deep in my chest. I scooped him up with one arm, pulling S.J. tightly to my side with the other. "Come on, little man," I said, kissing the top of my son's head. "Let's go show your mother her land." We walked out onto the porch together. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky awash in twilight. The massive expanse of the Thorn Ranch stretched out before us, vast, untamed, and entirely ours. I looked at Sarah Jane, her head resting on my shoulder, our son babbling happily in my arms. I had spent my life thinking my legacy was dirt and water. I was wrong. My legacy was right here, holding my hand, her roots finally planted deep in the Texas earth, blooming into a future no man could ever steal. We were home. At its heart, this story teaches us that family isn't just about time. It's about showing up when it matters most. It's about choosing honesty over comfort and love over distance. Here we share stories of the Wild West, of cowboys, of love that survives distance, of motherhood, and the quiet kindness between people who choose to care. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to like, comment your thoughts, share it with others, and subscribe to follow more stories like this. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.